Hey guys, so today we're going to be spending some time talking a little bit about the two presidents who follow Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So you should have this page of your packet. So Gerald Ford is, as I mentioned when we were talking about Watergate, holds a very unique place to being the United States' only ever unelected president. So basically what happens is Ford is appointed by Nixon to be vice president when Vice President Agnew resigns over bribery charges. Ford is the minority leader from Michigan, so the Republican minority leader in the House. He's seen as this really nice guy. They were kind of hoping that maybe like Ford could ease some of the Watergate tensions. Obviously that doesn't work, right? But be that as it may, Ford, as soon as Nixon resigns, Ford becomes our next president without having been elected. Remember, he's unelected. And he will go on to appoint a guy named Nelson Rockefeller to be vice president. But there's a big problem, right? So now that Ford is president, he wants to kind of move past Watergate and kind of, I'm president now, I can do my own thing. But he was VP under Nixon, even though he didn't even really like Nixon all that much. But basically, the press, every time they come to him, they're like, so Ford, what are we going to do about Nixon? What's going to happen? What are we going to do? Is Nixon going to go to trial? Is he going to be arrested? Is he going to go to jail? Like, what's going to happen? And Gerald Ford is just like, chill, y'all, we got to move on. Like, this is much. This is too much, right? And so Gerald Ford makes a very controversial decision. His solution to this problem is to pardon Nixon of all crimes, right? This means Nixon's not going to go to trial, not going to go to jail. He's off the hook, right? Now, as you can imagine, the outcome of this is pretty mixed. A lot of people were really upset about this. Like, they really thought that Nixon should be able to answer to his crimes. Like, this is something that destroyed the American trust of the presidency. And they were really upset about this. But Ford really defended this as the right idea. He was like, look, if we go to trial, it's going to make us look bad for the rest of the world, right? Like, we have a president that's going to trial. That's huge, okay? But also, he just wanted to wash his hands with it and be done, right? Like, I got to move on. We got to get over this. And so he was hoping that by pardoning Nixon, we could kind of move past it. But a lot of people were really upset that this decision was made. It did not help that the economy of the 1970s was not good, right? So we're experiencing something at the time called stagflation. So stagflation comes about when you have high unemployment and high inflation, right? Problem is, when you try to fix high unemployment, what tends to happen is inflation goes up. Well, that's not good. That just made that problem worse. Well, then when you try to fix the high inflation, unemployment goes up. And then you can kind of see it's not really helping. So the problem with stagflation is that you can't really fix one without hurting the other. The reason that this is happening is OPEC. So OPEC is all of the Middle Eastern countries that have oil, right? They basically form an organization where they say, well, we're gonna form a monopoly for oil, right? So what happens is you can't buy oil unless you go through OPEC, right? So the problem with this is OPEC decides that they're gonna cut off oil to the United States. They just cut it off, right? That's a problem because we use a lot of oil. If we can't buy oil, we're basically screwed, right? So that oil embargo is going to be the cause of the high inflation. So prices start rising. Once gas prices rise, then so does everything else. In terms of unemployment, the unemployment rate at this time is about 9%. Basically, factories are closing all over the country. Factory jobs, or the service industry is taking over the hard-working, blue-collar kind of job that used to exist. And so, as all of these factories are closing, we're going to see the decline of these, or the decline of the factories are closing. We're going to see a lot of people losing work, right? And that's going to be a really big problem. A lot of these service jobs come to the rise. So, what's going to end up happening is Ford is going to institute something he calls WIN, or Whip Inflation Now. So together we can whip inflation, right? So this is basically an encouragement of Americans to cut back on their oil and gas use. Basically saying, you just gotta give some of it up, right? So the problem is he offers no incentives to do this. This is not a law. This is just saying, hey, America, stop using your gas, right? Well, that's easy to say. The problem is when you use voluntary wages and price freezes, people don't have to do it. And it doesn't accomplish anything. This is the same problem Herbert Hoover had during the Great Depression. So he also encouraged the creation of jobs and the lowering of taxes as part of this program. So that is something that did come out of it. The problem is that Congress really won't compromise. Congress is really stuck. It's dominated by Democrats. The Republicans are really unpopular because of Watergate. And so it's just, they're not willing to compromise on making the problems. And because of this, the effect and the outcome of this is that unemployment gets better, but inflation got worse, right? So they fixed unemployment, but inflation went up, right? And so this is going to cause a really big problem, especially as Gerald Ford is moving out of the presidency. Jimmy Carter is going to have to deal with a lot of this. So Ford almost had no chance of winning re-election in 1976. Yeah, 1976, because really he was just so unpopular. The presidential pardon just really caused a lot of problems. And so he leaves office kind of disgraced. But really, when we look back at him, historians are like, actually, this guy was really honest, really open. He was a really good dude, right? He was just very underappreciated at his time. The stain of Watergate and Nixon was way too much. He was burdened with a bad economic problem and social challenges. He didn't have easy answers. He didn't have time to really come up with it. In other words, he was a weak president because of the circumstances he was in. Had he been president at a different time, he probably could have done all right. But he's just, you know, wrong place, wrong time kind of guy. So unfortunately for Jimmy Carter, things don't go so well for him. Or for Ford. Fortunately for Jimmy Carter, things don't go well for Gerald Ford. So Jimmy Carter is a very unusual guy to be president. He is pretty much the opposite. He is a born-again Christian, and his faith was very, very important to him. He's a Sunday school teacher. He was like, I go to a Baptist church. Like, this is my thing. I'm all about that. He also was a peanut farmer, not a politician, right? So basically, he is seen as this outsider. He's not tainted by Washington. He's not like been in Watergate and been in all of that scandal. And that's probably why he gets elected. So this idea of being a Washington outsider was huge for the time, right? So this guy was a really good, open, honest guy, but he inherits a lot of the problems of the late 60s and the 70s. So the oil shortage has continued. In fact, it has gotten worse because remember, inflation got worse. We are continuously depending on this oil, and it shows us how vulnerable we are. It shows us that we are not as great as we thought we were, and inflation was really, really high. So he does come up with some solutions, a couple of different solutions here. First, he passes the National Energy Act, which taxes these big gas guzzler cars. It is the first act to give tax credit for solar energy. The outcome of this is gas prices actually go on the rise. Yay, doesn't really work, right? Then in terms of inflation, he cuts spending. So what this does is actually allowed interest rates to rise. Yay. Doesn't really work again. So he gives this speech called the Malaise Speech. And basically in this speech, he laid out all of the problems, but he gave no solutions, and he blamed the American people for screwing up. He was like, you guys are just lazy slackers, and you should be better off at this. And so the American people were not impressed. They were like, wait, your job's to fix my problems. So I don't need you sitting here telling me I'm doing it wrong, right? Not cool. And so the problems for the oil shortage aren't really solved. You have one of the highest winters or coldest winters around.
Ms. Brelby, could you please call Ms. Lynch in the main office? Ms. Brelby, please call Ms. Lynch. Thank you.
And it just causes a lot of issues. In terms of foreign policy, we're going to see a lot of big changes. So basically, Jimmy Carter, as part of being this born-again Christian, part of being this really nice guy, he basically doesn't think that our foreign policies that we have had can match up with the Bill of Rights. And he really believes that we should be using human rights as a basic foreign policy. So in general, what his goal is to pressure countries around the world to protect human rights. Specifically, he's talking about the Soviet Union and China, right? Well, think about how they're going to feel about this. Probably not too great, right? So he starts getting on people, saying, you need to protect your people, you need to do this, we're going to cut off trade, we're going to cut off all of this. And it's not that great. A really specific way is he actually, in Panama, agrees to return the Panama Canal to Panama in about 20 years. So he's like, let us withdraw, get out, but once we do, we'll turn it over to you, right? A lot of people are really upset by this because that was a really big source of income. We built the Panama Canal, remember Theodore Roosevelt? But he's like, it's not ours. It should be theirs. They should control it. It's in their country. So that was a big thing. And the other thing that he decided to do was boycott the Moscow Olympics. Basically, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and he's like, you know what? We're not going in '89. We're done, right? So that was a big kind of slap in the face, or 79, not 89. That was a really big slap in the face. No Americans were at the Olympics that year. It was the Winter Olympics in Moscow that year. So the effect of this is détente is over. The USSR and China, our relationships worsen with them. They don't like the fact that we got on them about the whole civil rights thing. In addition, the Soviets decided that they're also going to boycott our Olympics in '84. So they're like, we're not coming to LA, kind of again as a slap in the face. And that may not seem like a big deal, but the Olympics have a really big meaning in foreign policy. And so it really was seen as this really big problem. So all of that work that Nixon had done to kind of warm up the Cold War, right, to make sure that like the Cold War was ending, we just kind of go right back to it, right? Great, Carter, thanks. This really comes to the head with the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. So in 1946, the State of Israel was created by the United Nations. The problem was it was created within the territory of Palestine. And so they had pretty much been at war since then. And there was a war in this early period called the Six-Day War, where Israel takes over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip away from the Palestinians and the Sinai Peninsula away from Egypt, right? Well, that's big, right? So Egypt is super pissed now. Palestine is super pissed now. All of the Middle East hates Israel. Israel is our ally. And basically, Carter's got to figure out how to deal with this. So he would hold something called the Camp David Accords. So he spends a few weeks with the leaders of Israel and Egypt, and they eventually come to a deal. Egypt recognizes Israel as a legitimate nation, and Israel returns the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, so that really big portion of the map that they took. This is huge. They'd been fighting since Israel had been there in 1946, and this is one of the first peace agreements that is ever made. So this is the biggest progress between Israel and their surrounding Arab nations, specifically Egypt, who was kind of the biggest baddie as opposed to Israel here. So that's a really big deal. The next thing we have is Iran. So of course, let's look on the map where Iran is, right here, the edge of the peninsula. So Iran has this problem, okay? So Iran hates us because we support their corrupt king, a guy named the Shah, right? So this is the Shah down here, right? And his wife and son. And basically there is a revolution in Iran in the 60s where this guy called the Ayatollah Khomeini leads a revolution and overturns the Shah, and the Shah flees to the United States. Well, this guy, Ayatollah Khomeini, who's this guy up here, he's like, oh, that is not gonna work for us. So in order to get the Shah back, he takes over the US embassy in Tehran, and 52 Americans are taken hostage until we return to the Shah. Oh boy, this is a stand down. This is huge. These are American citizens on what is technically American soil. The US embassy in Tehran is American soil. And these guys are basically being held there until we agree to give back the Shah. So you may be like, well, what's the problem, right? Well, the problem is we agreed to protect this guy. So we do attempt a rescue where a helicopter goes in, the Marines try to go in and get the people out. The two helicopters crash into each other. All 8 servicemen die. So in our attempt to rescue these 52 Americans, 8 Americans die because of friendly fire. They because they crash into each other. This looks like Carter can't do his job, right? It's this bungled attempt, and it looks terrible on Carter, okay? So finally, like again, after a year of these people being held hostage, none of them are killed, but they are held hostage for a year, you may be going, well, why don't we just give the Shah back, right? Like, it's not our country, not our problem. The problem is, when the Shah was here, he got cancer and died, right? Whoops. The problem, I mean, they're still not giving the hostages back. We can't give them the Shah, right? So in total, the hostages are held for over a year and 444 days. They are only released when Ronald Reagan is elected president. The moment he takes the oath of office, they are released, right? It was a slap in the face to Carter. It was basically Iran saying, we don't like your policies. We're glad you're not president anymore. Carter, obviously, loses his reelection bid to Ronald Reagan, and that's going to be kind of the end of it. But this was a really big deal. I don't think I can stress enough like the importance of the hostage crisis in America and how the American people felt about it. It was really big. So there's one last little thing. So affirmative action, which has become a really big thing in America at this time, feels a little bit of a backlash. So basically, a lot of people in the country are feeling like affirmative action is just what they call reverse discrimination. So rather than stopping discrimination, it's actually discrimination against white people, right? This really comes to a head in a Supreme Court case called California versus Bake. So Bake is a former military man, he was a soldier in Vietnam, who wants to become a doctor, right? And so what he is rejected from school, right? And he finds out that of the 100 people that were accepted into this program, 16 of them had to be minorities. And he was a white guy, right? And so basically he finds out that these minority candidates who had lower qualifications than him had been admitted to medical school just because they were black, right? Now, the California Supreme Court goes and says, you have to let this guy in. The UCA is like, well, no, we need minorities. And so they appeal to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court eventually comes out and says colleges cannot use quotas as race and use race as a factor, right? Or at least not have the only factor, right? So if you've got two qualified candidates and they have the exact same scores and the exact same grades and everything, and you're trying to decide between them, and you want to admit this guy because he's a minority, you can, right? But if this guy had better qualifications, he has to be admitted first. So it's basically this idea that they can't use affirmative action in order to admit people to college. This ruling still has a lot of effect even on you guys. Like, this is still something that colleges do. They look at race as a factor, but the key is that it can't be the only factor. Right? So that's where I want to kind of wrap up here. So Carter's legacy is that he's not a very effective president, unfortunately. He just didn't have enough experience. He has good ideas, right? But because he's an outsider, nobody wanted to work with him in Congress, right? They were like, what do you know? You're not a politician. Whatever, get out of here. He also, like Ford, was plagued with unsolvable economic problems. In fact, he kind of made them worse, right? The Camp David Accord was the best thing in his administration, no doubt. The brilliance of the Camp David Accord is amazing, but the Iranian hostage crisis follows right behind it, and it is overshadowed by that. He just did not handle it well, and that's a problem, right? So Carter's legacy is that he's a really great guy. He's done a lot of great stuff after he was president, but probably not the most effective president. He only serves one term. Ronald Reagan is going to come next. So we'll get into that in the next video. Until then, have a good one.